For most of human history, people have parented the way their parents and grandparents did, with culture providing the cues. We call this Parenting 1.0.
For various reasons, parents began to question these approaches, and we started turning more and more to so-called experts to learn to parent. This was the beginning of Parenting 2.0. This allowed for some real advances, but also a lot of confusion as we got further and further away from our natural parenting instincts.
Parenting 3.0 is about reclaiming those instincts and integrating them with our current understanding of child development. It brings together the wisdom of the past with the best scientific and psychological research of the present.
Parenting 3.0 isn't a fad or a quick fix. It's a set of principles that allows us to engage with our kids and life from an informed and empowered place.
I'm Jai Flicker.
And I'm Deb Blum.
Welcome to Parenting 3.0.
Hi everyone, we're so glad you're here today with us on our first episode. We're here today to answer the very important question, what is Parenting 3.0? So we're going to get into it in just a minute. The idea is that we'll give you a little bit of background on 1.0 and 2.0. Actually, we want to show that there has been a progression, that there was this thing that we have identified as Parenting 1.0 and another thing called Parenting 2.0. And we're hoping that it's going to resonate with you when we explain to you where we've been in the past, sort of where we might be tripping up a little bit in parenting. And then what we're offering to you is this Parenting 3.0 as an alternative or sort of an evolution that we believe will feel like it's really aligned with being a human being, with relating to other people, with development of children. And so before we get into that, we're going to tell you a little bit about where we've been in the past. So Jai, would you like to start talking about Parenting 1.0?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Happy to. So, we kind of do a quick overview of the three different stages in our intro. But just to reiterate, our conception of Parenting 1.0, it sort of stretches back into the dawn of humankind. It's really just parenting that was not even, it was not self-conscious. It wasn't thought of as, okay, a parent, nobody was using parenting strategies. It was just survival. It was how things were done. It was just taking care of your child within maybe, a tribal setting. And of course, over time, as society evolved and grew and different cultures took different shapes, what Parenting 1.0 looked like was different in different areas. It was regional. But if you kind of imagine 1,000 years ago, wherever you were on the planet, you probably really just were getting exposed to the way things were being done in your immediate family and in your immediate community. So there wasn't a lot of exchange of cultural information. There wasn't exposure to how vastly different cultures were operating or thinking. And there wasn't a lot of expertise to even turn to other than your just the people in your immediate surroundings. So if you add that all up, in some ways, whether family life was easy or hard, that's a whole separate issue. But regardless of how easy or hard family life and home life was, people weren't questioning parenting because that just couldn't really occur to them to do. It wasn't really a thing to to meditate on in the abstract. I would think there was much more of a immediacy to it of just dealing with whatever was happening and kind of doing your best to deal with it, and that was it.
And I don't know if you mentioned this, but I think the other piece is that the actual results, like, how children actually were raised, it was like a product of those circumstances. Like, it wasn't like because there was no one there like that was trying to like make it better or give you advice on what you should do. I mean, possibly a doctor may have sometimes given a little bit of input or something like that, but like really people were a product of the quality of the sort of the culture that they were raised in or the family they were raised in. And unlike, some of the things that we see happening in 2.0.
Yeah. And probably even more than, depends on, we're sort of jumping around in time here, but if you go back even further, it's probably, more likely to be a priest or a bishop, right. Or some religious leader kind of, or moral leader kind of saying how things should be. And then you try to live up to that and following, your faith and bringing kids into that faith, which obviously still happens all over the world today. But I think, again, if you go, I like to go back, well, as we'll talk more about shortly, we kind of agree that parenting 2.0 has its sort of roots in the sort of turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century, early 20th century. So if you go back 100 years, you're sort of in the beginning of the transition from 1.0 to 2.0. But if you go back 1,000 years or 5,000 years, right. Yeah, then you're safe.
Right.
So obviously families look very different. If you go back 5,000 or 10,000 years or 20,000 years, a lot happened. It's not like everyone was using the same parenting strategy for 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years. Right. It's more just that idea of parenting 1.0 is one that is drawn from your immediate surroundings. The people watching, generations were sort of closer together. Mm-hmm. And so you were much more likely to have 2 and 3 and maybe 4 generations all living together. So you were seeing how people were parenting. So there was just more direct experience. And that was how it was done. And so that was what people learned how to do.
Yeah. It makes me think about, I don't know this other than just like books I've read and other places that I've seen some history, but it seems like there might have been a lot more support. So maybe more aunts and uncles and grandparents and other people that were involved in raising your children too. So it wasn't just, a mom and a dad deciding what to do.
That's a great point.
So it was easy for culture to get kind of infused because you were all living together. And so, yes, of course, it would be more natural for people to be learning from one another and perhaps even, I don't say this in a negative way, but perhaps feeling the pressure to sort of just like do it that way. That's just what this is how it goes in this family or in this community or tribe. Yeah. So I think that's a different time and probably something that we could really learn from and maybe even benefit from having a little bit more support. I think that's something that people feel a lot of a lack in that.
Yes,
in present day.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it makes sense because if we evolved in community in at least in the going way back to tribal existence but if we evolved in extended families being kind of involved, then it makes sense that we're going to be kind of on some level psychologically, we're going to be expecting that. And when that doesn't show up, it's going to feel like, wait, where is everyone?
Right.
So, I mean, it's kind of like a lot of people, including myself along the way, growing up and then starting a family, I think talk about the importance of community. But I sometimes in that process haven't always understood why that's so important and really connecting it to the fact that until very recently, that's really how people were living. And that not just that it was incidental that we were living that way, but that we evolved to live that way it's like built into us,
right,
to want that, to expect that,
right, and perhaps even to need that.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I totally think so. So to start to look at how the transition from 1.0 to 2.0, because I think that's a really kind of important piece. And also, 2.0 is really we're gonna do, there's more to say about 2.0, and I think it's more important to understand it because it's more complex and it's more recent. It's more, I think, what is plaguing so many of us. 1.0 spanned a longer time period, but 2.0 is what is like really, really leading to a lot of the kind of confusion, like we talked about, that parents are grappling with today. So we want to really lay this out. Part of the reason there was a 2.0 to begin with was because, and this is going to get into the transition here, it's because, as going back to the 1700s, even earlier with with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, it's like science emerged and it was a powerful force. And first it was, people looking up at the sky and seeing patterns of how planets moved and how stars crossed the sky, and figuring out the laws of gravity and of inertia and of like heat and light bending through prisms, right? This was like understanding the physical world. And it was pointed out to me at one point that physics is sort of, easier. It's an easier science, if you will, than psychology, because figuring out how a planet revolves around a star, as complex as that is, it's kind of a simple thing compared to understanding how the human psyche works. So it makes sense that it would have taken longer for psychology to evolve and develop as a discipline. But really psychoanalysis and psychology, it really began, not psychoanalysis, psychology as a field. One of the early towering figures of that was William James, and he was kind of half part philosopher, part psychologist, and he really laid the groundwork for people to start looking inside the individual and trying to understand, make sense of it in the Western world. And then of course Freud came along in the he was born in 1859, so he was developing his theories and starting to popularize them towards the end of the 1800s and the turn of that century. And psychoanalysis was really, it's a very familiar concept for us today, but this was a new idea that, hey, we can start to see if people are having sort of personality disturbances, as they might have been called, we can find their roots in their childhood experiences, and making those connections between traumatic events and later phobias, and different relationships with parents, and how those early formative experiences would affect people later in life. And so this was all very new, but Freud went a long way towards educating the public that these were even possibilities. So this is why I think we agree that 2.0 came online around 1900, because this is when that was happening, and more people started in the early 1900s starting asking questions about, well, how do we, using this information, this new scientific psychological perspective, how do we apply that to child rearing, towards how do we apply it to education to be more effective, right? I don't think I don't think people in 1,000 years ago were asking that question in the abstract. They weren't asking, what's the right way to parent? They were just saying, what do we do with this particular kid
Right,
and this particular situation? So that's part of this shift. And I think, as we mentioned in the intro, that led to a lot of powerful advances and new understandings of subtleties of human nature, but led to some complicating issues as well.
Yeah, for sure.
So what are we needing to round out what I've said so far? I'm curious.
Well, I don't think there's much about parenting 1.0. I mean, there is so much, but I don't think there's much that's necessary for right now.
Yeah.
And I think that as far as the transition from parenting 1.0 to 2.0, no, I mean, I think that it was another piece to it that changed was that, yes, now there are some experts and they're talking about psychology. So psychology as a discipline is emerging. And then also this idea of how do we apply this to child rearing, but also what had changed. And it changed way back in 1440, but it's also been changing over the years at a faster and faster pace, is our access to information. And so if you think 1440 was the beginning with the printing press, that was, there were people who were really afraid of the printing press because it did change things. It was really the first, I would say, the democratization of information. And for some people that felt that there was some power in holding that information, it was a big shift. And so that was the beginning. But then every single time since then, there's been anything that's been a new technology and innovation, whether that be the radio or television, or then I like to differentiate between television and cable television because I think that was a massive shift. When people say that they blame things on the internet, I always say I think it was cable TV, really, because cable TV was the beginning of that. You had access to information everywhere across the country and world, versus prior to that you had television, but it was still local. And so things have changed so much. And then what I think most of us would agree with is that it's not only changed, but it's changed really quickly. So in the past, say 50 years, things have changed so fast that it's been almost like drinking from a fire hose, for people. And so, and I think most people would agree that it's even in the past 10 or 15 years, it's gone, exponentially faster with the internet and social media. So I think that that is something that has to be acknowledged as part of this shift, is that now we not only do we have experts that are doing research, but we now have access to that in a much more ubiquitous way.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Before you have a printing press, you can't really have, the access to, the written word was very limited. And so, it wasn't very practical to even learn how to read for most people because there weren't enough books for it to matter. Right. But then you fast forward just a few hundred years and you have newspapers and printed books. And so you could have people writing papers and having them disseminated widely. And we should talk more about this for sure as we get towards closer to now, because like you're saying, with the internet, we do have more and more access to more and more theories and different. It used to be that there wasn't enough, access to information was the problem. And so that's why a library would be such an amazing resource, because you could go somewhere and there'd be all this concentration of information. And I think we've definitely hit a tipping point where we've gone to the other side, where our problem isn't that we need access to information. It's that we have access to so much information that what we need is a filter. We need to have better sorting mechanisms. This is why Google is one of the biggest companies in the world is because they came along and said, you know what, we're going to organize this thing called the internet, which it's like all over the place, so that you can type in a certain search term and get relevant information. So that's one kind of filter, but it's like we need an extra level of filtering on that, because if you type in parenting, you're going to get an immense range of like ideas and thoughts and concepts. And so to sort of narrow things down now is more important.
Yeah, well, especially because on the internet, we all know that you're not getting the experts' opinions only. And I'm not even trying to say that that's bad, but you're getting a lot of anecdotal opinions. And I know for me, it was really, really helpful for me to have moms' opinions about things, because there were times when moms had really creative solutions to problems that were really practical problems. Like I had a baby who had a milk intolerance and reflux, and I needed to be able to go on there and search I remember searching on Dr. Spock's forum, and people have actually come to me and said that they've found things that I've posted on there from 15, 17 years ago, and so there were places where I could get support. So it was wonderful on the one hand to be able to get anecdotal, experiential feedback from mothers who have been through it. On the other hand, it's also just who to trust, where to go with things, So that's where I think that it's gotten a little bit more murky for people,
right?
And it just it keeps growing and growing and growing,
right? Exactly, yeah. It's interesting because I think some of that sort of turning to other mothers in your case, other parents, it kind of goes back to, there's an element of it that goes back to Parenting 1.0, which is, I think, an important integration. And this is part of what we're going to get into shortly, is how 2.0, in the excitement and enthusiasm of the new, more rigorous, more scientific approach to life and to parenting, there was a rejection of all that was 1.0, and that we ended up throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and just like, we need community, that's an element of it. I guess it's not even just like it, it's an example of it. It's like there's an element of just connecting with other people who are going through and living the same experience, and you just, I was at a birthday party over the weekend, and I have a 2-year-old, and hearing other parents go, oh yeah, we're dealing with the same thing. It wasn't really so much that I was even getting advice, although sometimes that does happen, which is super helpful, but also just going through it with other people is like you said, it's a human need. And so if we're only in those moments of challenge only turning to experts, or only turning to books to figure out what to do, there's a part of our experience that's going unmet.
Yeah.
And I'm also struck by the fact that it is complicated, because the forums that we enter into, you can sometimes get a sense of community and even some really good ideas. In fact, there's even a New York Times like health columnist who will take these intractable medical conditions. There's a show on this now, I think it's on Netflix, and she will say, hey, this person has tried everything and then the doctors don't know what to do. Have you ever experienced this? And we'll put it out, and it's like people from all over the world will see this and then go, oh, well, I actually had that same thing and we figured this out. And so there's a way in which, like, using the internet to crowdsource from the entire planet, it's so powerful. And it also can lead to really weird corners of the cyberspace where people are, in echo chambers and kind of just reinforcing kind of just misguided beliefs or just limited views and saying all sorts of crazy things. I mean, it's like we all know it's like almost like a joke. How insane it can get. How insane it can get. So this is sort of the age we're obviously living in. But getting back to the beginning of 2.0, a really helpful figure to start with is John Watson. He was an early behaviorist, and he published a book, speaking of the printed word, in 1928. I have a copy of it here. It's called Psychological Care of Infant and Child. And I had heard about this guy. I kept hearing about this guy because I've been interested in, as it will become clear, behaviorism and how that influences our parenting today, and what the kind of strengths of that approach are and what some of the shortcomings are. Several of the theories and the theorists that I find the most useful started out as behaviorists themselves, and then basically saw the limitations of that framework and evolved something new and something more developmentally oriented that I think is really important to know about. And so when I started looking at the roots of behaviorism, I would first find B.F. Skinner. He was such a towering figure in that field, Harvard psychologist and author. And he was the guy who was doing, they literally named the Skinner boxes, the boxes where they would put a rat or a pigeon in and do these tests to see when they would give them shocks and press the button for the food pellet, and those were called Skinner boxes, named after B.F. Skinner. But if you go back before him, the earlier name that kept popping up was this guy John B. Watson, and so I finally, kind of recently, found a copy of his book and printed it out and started reading through it, and was pretty shocked. Even though I already kind of knew somewhat what to expect, I was pretty shocked what I found.
Me too.
So I want to share a few of these. I have it right here. I want to share a few of the quotes from this, partly because it's entertaining, partly because it's shocking, partly because it's informative, and also, which I'll explain, partly because it helps. He's really writing, you can hear it in his writing, he's really writing at this transition from 1.0 to 2.0, and he's naming it very explicitly. So, for example, in the introduction, he says, "We have only just begun to believe that there is such a thing as the psychological care of infants and children." So that's such a given today that it's like, obviously infants have psychological needs. But this is not even 100 years ago, and he's kind of naming it like this is a new idea. So it's just really not that old. And so he's saying parents, and then mothers especially, resent. He says they resent any advice or instructions on how to care psychologically for their children. What parents want advice on how much affection they should bestow upon their children, or any word about how their children should be handled or treated hourly in the home? Hourly. Okay, there's some extremeness here that and then he puts it in quotes as if this is the parent protesting. "I can't take my child up in my lap. I can't let my children sleep together. I can't let my child play around me all I want to." So this is page 2 of the introduction, and you're starting to get a sense of how sort of rigid and extreme the view of this more scientific approach was of behaviorism at its inception.
Well, and you're also starting to see, though, that there is pushback that there was, 1.0
Absolutely,
was
yes.
this time where when it was in that shift, it wasn't like parents were just like excited to have new information. They were like, wait a second, we've been doing this parenting thing. Maybe they didn't call it that, but we've been doing child rearing and we've been doing it just fine. And so what do you mean you're going to come in here and tell me to do this thing in this way?
Yes. I'm trying to find this one part that really captures that. Let me see if this might be it, hopefully. Okay. If not, I'll just read it anyway. He says, this is chapter 1, and he says, the oldest profession of the race today is facing failure. This profession is parenthood. Many thousands of mothers do not even know that parenthood should be numbered among the professions. They do not realize that there are any special problems involved in rearing children. For them, the age-old belief that all that children need is food as often as they call for it, warm clothes, and a roof over their heads at night is enough. Nature, in quotes, does the rest, almost unaided. They argue that parents have been rearing children for a great many centuries. Therefore, why bother about learning anything new?
Yeah.
And there it is. That's the protests of mothers who are still in Parenting 1.0 saying, we've been managing just fine, thank you very much, for centuries. Like, why do I suddenly need to listen to you? And there's another quote here, a funny thing. Let me skip ahead here. He was giving a lecture, and this woman comes up to him. He says, this is in chapter 3, which is entitled The Dangers of Too Much Mother Love. It just captures it so. There was a way in which he really just wasn't holding back. And so I think it's helpful. It's like unadulterated behaviorism. And I think that, obviously, behaviorism has evolved, so it's actually gotten less extreme, but it's also, some of it is that the language has been sanitized. Mm-hmm. So I think it's kind of...
And his was not.
His was not. That was, it's really helpful. He says, once at the close of a lecture before parents, a dear old lady got up and said, quote, "Thank God my children are grown and that I had a chance to enjoy them before I met you." And I love that. Because I feel like you can hear, I don't know, in that comment that she is in touch with something like, you know what, I'm like enjoying the very ancient, sort of simple but not easy process of just enjoying raising my children and loving them and living with them.
Well, but I don't think that what we've said yet is what he believes, because I kind of feel like that's the key thing, like, right, is to reveal like what this man thinks.
Yes.
I don't want to skip ahead if you're not ready, but I think that I might have been sitting at the edge of my seat dying to know what it was that he says thought. If I didn't already know.
Thank you for reeling me in. I mean, this is part of it. I have to admit, it's still sort of new to me, and I've read all these quotes before, and each time I read them again, I just kind of, my mind just explodes.
Yes, mine too. But I still want to keep, if there were other ones, I want to keep reading any of the other quotes because they're so helpful. But I do think that getting to a little bit of what he does or what he believes in or what he prescribes to parents might help people to understand how shocking he is. Yes. Because I was really shocked.
Okay, so here's another excerpt that I think starts to get to what you're pointing to. His beliefs, right? And he says, "It is a serious question in my mind whether there should be individual homes for children, or even whether children should know their own parents."
I know, it's crazy.
It's not, it's like I'm actually reading this right. There are undoubtedly much more scientific ways of bringing up children, which will probably mean finer and happier children. So he's really he's looking around, okay, to just be sympathetic to him or something for a second. He's looking around, and from his perspective, he's seeing kids get maybe spoiled or, whatever his critique is, and going like, oh no, this will never. He's wanting to elevate humanity, but it's just so extreme, and I think misguided, right? It was, I think, good intentions, but went too far. He continues. He says, I suppose parents want their children to be happy, efficient, well-adjusted to life. But if I were to offer to take any mother's child and guarantee it such an upbringing, and were even to convince the mother at the same time that she was unquestionably unfitted to bring up her child, that's offensive, that she would inevitably bring up a weakling, a petted, spoiled, sullen, shy youngster who would grow up a liar and a thief, would she give up the child to me? No! The social pressure to have a child, to own a child, to be known in the community as a woman with a legitimate child is strong. It is a part of our mores. So he's attributing there, one important thing is he's attributing the reason why a mother would want to hold on to her child to these social pressures or to be known in the community as a woman with a legitimate child. Like, right. Wow. Talk about some blind spots, right?
Some blind spots.
But sure. Yeah, so he that was his view, is like, parents and mothers don't understand how to raise kids, and we need to basically kind of engineer them.
Yep.
That's pretty much, and the behaviorist, the reason it's called behaviorism is because they were studying starting with animals, how to basically, with rewards and punishments, how to get desired behavior. It was a project of control. It was about desirability of certain behaviors and the undesirability of certain other behaviors and attitudes and sentiments, and how do you scientifically train them out.
Right. And we do see that as present. I mean, that's present in parenting still, just
Absolutely.
Not right.
Absolutely.
Just not in this extreme way that we're seeing it here. It's certainly there, and if nothing else, the impulse to manage our child's behavior is there, even whether we act on it or we don't act on it. But the impulse is there, and So. So keep going.
This gives another insight into how this one guy, of course, was seeing, but I think he set the stage for a lot to follow. He says, since the behaviorists find little that corresponds to instincts in children, okay, so they're looking at these children and they're seeing blank slates. There are no instincts in children. Since children are made, not born, failure to bring up a happy child, a well-adjusted child, assuming bodily health, falls upon the parents' shoulders. So this is important for at least two reasons that I can think of. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. But one is that this view that the child is a blank slate is a very specific starting point, and it's, I would argue, an incorrect view. Based on everything that I've researched and much subsequent developmental psychology, that's not the case. But if you start from that, then it leads to point number 2, which is that if you have a blank slate, just tabula rasa, then all the responsibility for every little behavior is going to be the responsibility of the parents. And so it leads to, in a weird way, and I think we've both seen a lot of this in our current day practices, an over burden of responsibility on parents, feeling so much pressure to shape their kids in every little way, because going back to this original idea, if we don't do it, it's not going to happen, because they're blank slates sort of waiting to be shaped, and so we got to do it.
Right.
So, yeah.
And yet he does start to talk about, he does start to bring in this idea, though, of self-conscious parenting. This is where it enters, right? He starts, I would say, because he talks about, that it's all on the parents.
Well, that very paragraph goes on. He says, since the most serious faults in the rearing of children are to be found on the emotional side, I put a special emphasis upon the growth of emotional habits. That's not what I wanted to read. The acceptance of this view makes child rearing the most important of all social obligations. Mm-hmm. So it does, it's sort of like, on the one hand, it's like, it feels good to be taking parenting so seriously. On the other hand, I think it has led to overly anxious parents.
Right. That's where I was going to go with it, is that I feel like, on the one hand, like, I'm all for elevating parenting as such the critical role that it is. And I'm all for helping parents to look at this and see places where we have our own blind spots and places where we can develop. But it definitely was not, his advice isn't the one that I'd be, cheering for the parents to be looking at. But there were times, there were things that we read in this that I did feel like I was in agreement with him philosophically, that there might have been some value in us examining our parenting. Even if I didn't agree with his hypothesis. Have you? Can I share the one about kissing? Or are we waiting for? Do you have an actual quote on that? Or do you do? Well, do you want to do the quote? Because the kissing one might have been the first one that kind of made me almost grasp my heart. And I think I was actually on the treadmill when it was happening, and I was starting to worry about my my health for a moment.
Let me find this here. It's pretty nuts. Here we go. Not long ago, I went motoring with two boys aged 4 and 2, their mother, grandmother, and a nurse. In the course of the 2-hour ride, one of the children was kissed 32 times, 4 by his mother, 8 by the nurse, and 20 times by his grandmother. The other child was almost equally smothered in love. But there are not many mothers like that, you say. Mothers are getting modern. They do not kiss and fondle their children nearly so much as they used to. Unfortunately, this is not true. I once let slip in a lecture some of my ideas on the dangers lurking in the mother's kiss. Immediately, thousands of newspapers wrote scathing editorials on, quote, "Don't kiss the baby." Hundreds of letters poured in, judging from them kissing the baby to death is just about as popular a sport as it ever was, except for a very small part of our population. Is it just the hard-heartedness of the behaviorist, his lack of sentiment, that makes him object to kissing? Not at all. There are serious rocks ahead for the over-kissed child. Before I name them, I want to explain how love grows up. So he goes on to this whole theory of this, but he really believed that showing affection was basically giving rewards for nothing. And so from a purely behaviorist standpoint, it was a recipe for disaster.
Yep, I know. And it's so crazy to me it's just so crazy to me intuitively, and like I'll just use it for speaking for myself, my mother's instinct, just says, what? But the craziest part about that was that not only did he say that too much kissing of your child would be bad for them, but too much in his mind was one time per year.
More than once a year.
No more than once a year.
Yeah, more than once a year was too much.
That's crazy.
That's okay, like once a year, if you just it's kind of like, Christmas.
Right.
You give them a kiss.
Okay, fine.
Yeah,
it's a gift. It's a gift. I know they were told, I think it was, so when did he write that?
This was published in 1928.
1928, because it started actually in 1910, where there were people that was like the beginning of being warned not to indulge your children with too much affection.
Yeah.
And, and then it was, don't hug your kids, instead have them sit on your lap, shake their hands or pat their heads. And this idea that ignoring your baby or your child builds character. Yeah. So it builds character in them. I mean, and that doesn't even, by the way, like, aside from Watson, there's also these other things like just, putting your kids in a metal cage and.
What?
Yes. In the 1930s, it was recommended. I mean, you could argue a crib is kind of that, but that wasn't what it was. This was like over the top of them.
Yeah.
They were caged in like they were little animals or something. And then, 1940s was don't coddle your boys. I mean, there have definitely been some misguided bits of advice that are out there. My recollection about Watson, though he's very well educated and a smart man, his background, though, was that he was raised by a mother who treated him this way, is my memory of what I heard about him, and that he, it's this very sterile way of looking at parenting, right? I mean, and it sounded to me, what I heard was that he was raised in an environment that was pretty sterile.
Yeah. Yeah. So he may have been working through some of his own stuff. It actually, I want to digress into something really short and quick about that, but it's an important blind spot for all of us to see. Yeah.
And, I'm in this training program with Dr. Gabor Mate, Compassionate Inquiry. And one of the things that he talks about is that when a child is in a situation where they're being, say, I'm just going to use this word for lack of a better word at the moment, but somehow mistreated by their parent, they're in a position where if they judge their parent's behavior as bad, that's actually really dangerous for the child to do, because that means that then they're not being taken care of. So it's actually easier for them to judge themselves as bad. So to judge, for the child to judge itself or his or herself as bad, and look at the parent's behavior as that must be the good behavior. That must be what it should be. Yeah. So in some ways, it's kind of what might, I mean, I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist able to diagnose him, but like there's some way that I can see that for him, he may have wanted to justify his mother's behavior so that he could say, oh, well, she did it right. And look at me, I turned out great. Kind of.
Yeah.
So
I love that.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's just an interesting kind of like a side interpretation of the possibility of where this is coming from.
Sure.
Which doesn't make me that hopeful about our experts, but that's okay.
Yeah. No, but I think
we've learned a lot.
And I think I'm glad you brought that up while we're talking about it. It's like that when I first heard a version of that kids will kind of, if their parents aren't even showing them this is the problem with his whole theory. It's like if a child is expecting to be receiving some love in an instant and doesn't get it, the move is towards going, oh, there must be something wrong with me, and that just hit home so much, because it doesn't even have to be mistreatment.
Exactly.
I mean, there is plenty of mistreatment. I don't even mean to say that that's not it, but just it could be even the subtlest thing of really going for that moment of connection, and the parent is making just getting, I don't know, preparing for the day, and it just and it's a missed opportunity, but the child goes, oh, I guess there must be something wrong with me, and it's that it can be that tender and that little. Yeah. So it's just there's a lot to it. Right.
And the other thing that I like, just to, stick with this for just one more moment, is that I think that, those things will happen because we aren't, we're going to be distracted, and there are times that those can happen, and there is some tolerance for that in relationships. There's some tolerance. It's just that when it keeps happening repetitively, it can really imprint a story in a child that they are, that they now have to be the one that's owning, like, well, the reason why I'm not getting that is because I did something wrong, or I'm bad, or I'm wrong. And so there's a way of like us knowing the importance of those the almost the exact opposite of what Watson's saying is that no, you really can't use affection as currency. You can't use like attachment and love and connection as currency. Those must be a given in the parent-child relationship. Yeah. Sorry. I'm giving, it's like a little foreshadowing for Parenting 3.0.
We'll be talking at length about some of this stuff. Yeah. No, that's good though. That's really good. So I don't want to, I mean, I'm personally, like I said, so like shocked by what I found when I printed that out that I'm spending a little bit, maybe too much time on it, but that's just, I think, an important milestone, turning point maybe in our sort of history of parenting, because it was really, he was very explicitly saying like, you don't know what you're doing. You parents you really don't know. You have no idea. In one part he says literally, no one today knows enough to raise a child. No one. So when you fast forward to today, when you have a lot of parents who are feeling like they don't know how to deal with certain situations, or they don't know they don't feel like fully empowered as parents, and like they're really feeling competent in their day-to-day interactions with their children, there's a way in which that started more recently than we might have realized, and it was maybe unintentionally, or actually probably intentionally being cultivated, but not just as a purely manipulative thing, but to try to motivate people to pay attention, to listen to his theories, and going like, you do not know what you're doing, you need to listen to me, right? And so interestingly, moving forward a few decades, and speaking of Dr. Spock, who you referenced, he came along, and I didn't actually know this until recently myself. He came along and said, "Hey, you know," his famous quote was, "You know more than you think you do," and so he was really attempting to balance that out and re-empower parents to trust themselves more. And I think I am definitely more in that camp. I think that's really important. And it's not just because it feels good to feel empowered, although it does. There's some very specific reasons that I now understand, based on how attachment works, that it's important for a parent to be empowered. It's good. It's not good. It's not just good for the parent. I would say it's sort of incidentally, it happens to be good for the parent, but it's essential for the health of the child for the parent to be as empowered as possible. And so part of what I want to do here, and I don't want to speak for you, but I think we want to do is help empower parents, so that for their benefit and especially for the benefit of the kids. Absolutely.
And I think that part of that, and I want to talk about Dr. Spock too, but part of that is that it's almost as if when you keep on getting all of these different opinions layered upon our thinking, it's so easy to then be confused and lack confidence. And so we're not, I don't think we're here saying that we kind of know every solution to every problem. That's not really what we're here to do. No. But we're here to say, like, how can we help you how can we pick out the theories that exist in the world that are the most aligned with human nature and what our children need, and with our parenting instincts, to help to sort of help us remember that. And it's almost as if we're saying, let's go back. Oh no, I'm saying what Parenting 3.0 is, but anyway, it's okay. We're just going to do it for a moment. We're saying, like, let's go back to the pre-1900s, the thousands of years, and find those places where people really did just have an innate sense of, this is how I parent. those things that were like beautiful and kind of like weaved into being a human being and a mammal,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And then also over the past 100 and say 20 years, what have we learned? You know, and there
Yes.
have been so many things we've learned that are critically important,
Yeah.
that help us to be far better parents, and especially in the current day and age that we live in. You know, I mean, it was
Yeah.
a very different time than
Right.
200 to, you know, thousands of years
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah.
And so we need to know this, we need this better information. I know people are like craving both,
That's right.
you know, and so
Well, because part of the problem with just saying, as Dr. Spock did, which I think was really important at the time, was to say, hey, you know more than you think you do. That's really powerful. But if that's the sort of overriding message where you go, oh, I'm having this problem, and it's like, just trust your instincts, which I want to, obviously I'm trying to distinguish what we're saying here from that. It's sort of not enough information.
right.
But so then it puts you immediately back into the problem of, well, then, now I'm just back to relying on experts again. And so part of what we're trying to do, and this is starting to speak to Parenting 3.0, is to say, unlike those mothers who, when they first heard the extreme behaviorist solution or approach being professed by Watson, they were going like, this is crazy. I'm glad I am done raising my children, before hearing from you. We want it to be, and I think we've both had this experience time and time again with the theories that we're going to be talking about, where you hear something and it kind of a light bulb goes off both in your mind. You go, oh, that's why that happens that way, that's why that works, but it also reinvigorates your instinct, your gut, and it goes, that also feels right, that also, and not just because I want it to, but because it's like there's something deep and ancient and primal there. It's like, actually, like you said, remembering, it's reconnecting us to something that's been part of the human experience for tens of thousands of years, if not longer.
Exactly. And so I agree. So I guess that when I think about Dr. Spock, first of all, I'm just so grateful that Dr. Spock came along, but that's not what he's really known for, by the way. I mean, he's known for books afterwards usually. I think that was like 1946 when he came along and he said that.
Yeah.
And I really just commend him for his intention, which was to basically say, if it doesn't feel right, like, you do know, like, don't do it. So, because on the flip side to what you just said, you also have people who, they are doing things that don't feel good, and they're doing it because they were told to do it, and I'm going to use cry it out, not because I want to that's a touchy one, and believe me, I did, some of it too, so it's not like I'm here making a judgment, but we know, I'll speak for me. I know when I did cry it out, even if I just did it for short periods of time, it felt wrong. But I was also grappling, just like with many parents, we're grappling with that, like, okay, but I also need some sleep. So it's sometimes you're making conscious choices and you're trying to like weigh out what the right things are. But sometimes people do things just because an expert told them to, and they've really shut down any access to those inner voices, those inner feelings and sensations that say, no, this has gone too far. And that's what I think is trying to be awoken, is to say, like, wait, you do have a lot of this inside of you.
Yeah.
And, I just want to say with Dr. Spock, what he also said was that there's common sense in parenting. And I think that I appreciated that just because I think that's true. And he says, and your gut is what you should listen to. Mothers should trust their instincts. And, he was the one that was the antithesis of these more sterile parenting styles, and that, that they should feel, and that's what the other thing he said, though, is that they should feel in their gut the advice that they were getting doesn't feel right, and they should listen to their instincts first.
Yeah.
And, and he said it, but that they say, this was actually a quote of his, and he said, but what happens is, that they know in their instincts that it's wrong, but their books and magazines told them that they should do it.
It's almost, it's almost like Parenting 3.0 started with Spock. I mean, the early, like, just like like Parenting 2.0 it sort of started slowly and then really took off later. Like, we haven't even mentioned the parenting statistic about I'll say it now. There's a thing on a service that Google provides called Ngram, Ngram, Ngram. It's the Ngram viewer, and they've scanned in so many books that you can type in a single word and see how often it has been used over hundreds of years. And if you type in the word parenting, it's nuts. If you go back to 1800, it just creeps along almost at like 0. And then right around 1970, it just shoots up.
It's crazy.
All of a sudden, parenting was like a concept that was being talked about.
Yeah, it's a verb. It became a verb.
It became a verb. And before that, it just wasn't even it wasn't kind of a topic of written conversation. So even though we're sort of going all the way back to 1900, there was a long period of time where it was still just sort of brewing, the idea of parenting, and that it really became this almost obsession starting in the 70s. Yeah. So in that same way, I think what we're talking about does have its roots for sure. I mean, when you hear those quotes, like for sure in what Dr. Spock brought, and to be fair, I mean, I think it was a huge relief. His book went on to be a multi-million copy bestseller, and so it was helpful, but very helpful, hugely helpful. But I think two things. I think one, we've gotten away from that, and part of it is because of what we've been talking about in terms of an overwhelming access to information. I think there's some other cultural factors in terms of, I mean, going back to the 80s, the missing children on milk cartons.
Yep.
And like that turns out to have been an actual turning point in like the level of anxiety and fear on the minds of parents, right? Because even though society was getting safer and child abductions were getting far fewer, it was in your face every time you were like pouring your kids cereal. And that, like, I think it was a collective unintentional traumatization of the population. And also with more access to news, if some crazy thing happened across the country, we would hear about it.
Right. Well, because there were some high profile, really big, bad abductions that had happened in I think the 70s and 80s.
Yes. Right.
And we knew about them when maybe before you just wouldn't have even known.
And with cable television, as you were mentioning, it's like, they have the 24-hour news cycle. So it's like, you gotta constantly be, coming up with something else to talk about. And then I think, also the, just the shift in politics and I mean, there's just, society and culture keeps on changing and evolving and growing and going through different phases. And so I think we've come a long way in the past, say 50, 60 years in terms of actual neuroscience, in terms of brain imaging, in terms of connecting that with child development. And so there's a level of rigor available to us now that wasn't available to him then.
Right.
So that's, I think, helpful and kind of proves out not all of what he was talking about, but a lot of what he was talking about.
Yeah. And I think that when you look at the period of time, say from like from 1900 to now, you can see that there's been like a mishmash of so many different things. And even in present day, it's not as if we would say, no one has a behavior. Well, we talked about this before, like people still are looking at behavior modification. People are also looking at, trying to trust their instincts. And, you've got like all different types of parenting philosophies that are just in a big pool. And that's part of the challenge that we have right now, is kind of like what's right, what's wrong, what's helping our children, what's not helping our children. And I think that being in a place right now, at least where we live, we know that it's really a big push toward a much more progressive model of parenting, and more, I think parents are trying to, I would at least say for, I don't know, you can maybe tell me how long you think it is, but there's been definitely an orientation toward like helping our kids to have a rich emotional life, and, you know, knowing that they aren't just these blank slates, but they do come in with personalities and kind of like other things that are going on, and trying to sort of help them to unfold into who they are. And they're all like really great. They're, in my own personal opinion, I think it's wonderful to let your child unfold into who they are meant to become. But sometimes it can get confusing. Like, okay, well, wait, if I'm doing that, does that mean I can't ever have a boundary? Does that mean I can't ever tell them not to do something? And so it is really a confusing time. And that's one of the biggest problems with Parenting 2.0, is that it's left us in this place where we are just pulled in so many directions by so many expert opinions. And it's hard because there's no one underlying framework that we're working off of. It's just, this is what you should do in this situation, and this is what you should do in that situation. The way that I have experienced Parenting 2.0 has been this pressure that I should be really good at everything, that I really need to know exactly how to handle every situation, and that I have to, and that I have this sense that in some way that there is a right way. And it's kind of a funny thing, because when we get into Parenting 3.0, I definitely feel like there are some ways that we're going to present what we think are really like core elements of how to be a parent that is best for our children. But there's something different about Parenting 2.0 that feels to me like it's just pulling me in a lot of directions, or it was pulling me in a lot of directions. And I guess I just would say it was just a tremendous amount of pressure. And then I think when we look at in the internet, and the way that the internet has just made information so ubiquitous, we know what everybody's doing everywhere. And there's a little bit of a keeping up with the Joneses that happens. And then I think when we look at our children and we chart their lives out, and we look at things like, well, we want them to be able to go to the best college, for example. If we start doing that, then we have all these ways we back ourselves into it, that we have to, that our child has to be on track at a certain age. And you know, everything that is happening, it's like it's a constant barrage of pressure to be a certain way in order to get our kids to be able to do a certain thing so that they can achieve this thing called success. And it feels like it's not right. It's not really coming from like what's best for our child. It's kind of coming, it's like we've gotten caught up in a whirlwind of like achievement and moving towards something.
Yes. So. And I think the key, the common idea or the common issue or problem there is that, in everything you're saying, is that parents are taking all these cues from everywhere but their own internal guidance. And that's this instinct that we've gotten out of touch with. And when we are completely disconnected from that to the point where we can't even find that voice within us at all, that's where I think that's the source of that sense of pressure. There's an external pressure to keep up with the Joneses, but there's also that I think we're susceptible to that when we feel unmoored. And so
for sure.
And so so there's this in 3.0, and there's this simultaneous move to reclaim that inner guidance, that inner connection to instinct and to our own knowing, so that we are being self-referencing, and also a gathering of information that is not, it's not as much strategic as it is a set of principles that help us understand what's going on. And I think this is the distinction you're getting at, is there's a big difference between having a kind of a I don't even want to call it a mosaic, because a mosaic implies that it's a big picture made of little pieces, but rather it's like a shotgun, just scattering of a bunch of things to do. In this situation, do this. In that situation, do this. And then just you kind of, at some point, I think people start to run themselves ragged trying to hold on to all these fragmented ideas, parenting techniques or tips. And whereas if you actually, even though it kind of takes longer to assemble, if you have a set of principles that explain human behavior, that explain human motivation, that explain parent-child dynamics, then more, and the deeper that understanding gets, the more different situations make sense, because they all start to fit in. We see through to the depths of them rather than the surface differences, the universal nature underlying these many situations. So that's obviously super helpful. Mm-hmm. And I think I just want to give a nod to 2.0 before we move on, and say, and I didn't see this at first. I was really looking at parenting 2.0 through a more negative lens, because people are so feeling so lost and fragmented in their thinking about how to raise kids. But at the same time, I think there was an important move from 1.0 to 2.0 that was about opening our minds to new possibilities. Because if somebody were to just be squarely in 1.0, and we came along and said, you know what, there's all this amazing research on human nature, and we're going to shed some light on how your child is acting and why, and that person was just squarely in 1.0, I don't think they would be open-minded enough to take it in and make good use of it. They just say, you know what, this is how we've always done it, and this is how we're going to do it.
Right.
So the 2.0 had this really important element of creating this openness, and it's just, so it's this, but if we think of it as the end phase, it's problematic. But if we understand that as a transition phase, it's more properly placed.
I think that's a really great way to look at it. And I really feel like we have been going through a transition. In a lot of ways, I know people have said to me that they feel like we're guinea pigs because we're also a product of a really fast changing technological environment. And so there's a way that we're all just trying to figure it out as we go along. And then I also think there's a lot of fear. And so I think that's when, as we like right now make a conscious movement to talking about parenting 3.0, I think there's this way that we're interested in. I think if I were to say what I want, it would be for people to feel like parenting actually does feel more natural again. I want people to feel like they are, I'm being careful with the word I use. I'm saying in control, and I don't mean controlling, but I mean feeling in control, feeling like they...
Not in control of their kids.
Right.
But of their lives.
In control of their lives, right. And in control of themselves.
Yeah.
I think there's like a real sense that parents are feeling a lot of, why do I react all the time? I'm always like losing it on them. And so some sense of feeling like they actually know what they're doing. They are kind of having a sense of like what their children need and how they can be the best solution for them, and how...
I have a friendly amendment to that.
Okay.
Because I think the sense of being out of control is pretty pervasive. And so it makes sense that then we might say, well, we want to help them be in control as opposed to out of control. But I feel like a better word is empowered. Mm-hmm. If we're feeling out of control and then we feel empowered, we're not going to feel so out of control. And it might not have to do with being in control. It might be about having a deep sense of understanding and a deep sense of connection to oneself, And so a higher tolerance for some volatility or some uncertainty or unknown, and some deeper sense of trust in the process, and that things are going to be okay, and that we don't have to be in control in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that we do feel a sense of just more general competence.
Yeah.
And that's such an important indicator of just general well-being. It's an ingredient for
Mm-hmm.
our sense of security in life, is to feel like we're up to whatever task we are facing.
Yeah.
And so what do you think about that?
I completely agree. I mean, I think there are people out there who feel really out of control. And so
Yes.
probably it sounds pretty attractive to imagine being in
Yes,
control.
yes.
And so, but I think your nuanced description is far more accurate to what we're trying to do here. And that it's,
Cool. Okay.
and that it's so personal. And so it's this idea, I think, that it does require us to be self-aware. We do need to take a look at, what we're doing and how we relate to our child. And we do need to, I liked what you said, have patience and be able to see that, this is a journey that we're on with our children. And part of the fear that we get caught up in is a fear that our kids are missing the mark, or our kids aren't getting there on time, that we're not in control. That is part of the fear, is somehow that we're not in control. So what we're moving toward is this idea that maybe, right, like you said, maybe it's not in control that matters, but it's some sense of feeling some competence as a parent.
Yeah.
And feeling a sense that when you're in situations that you are able to handle the situation, and that you might not even know all the answers, but that somehow that your presence is actually, able to feel that confidence in parenting.
Love it.
Yeah.
And I want to, before we end here, I want to bring in one more thing that you were talking about earlier that I just think is so powerful, so important, and such a, is going to be a theme of all of our future conversations as well. And that is, I'm gonna sum it up as sort of the very human art of relationship, of relating.
Yeah.
And we have gotten so caught up in trying to do the right things and get our kids to do the right things that we have lost touch with and shifted away from the focusing on parenting as first and foremost as a relationship.
For sure.
Yeah. And so I don't know if you want to add to that, because you were really kind of nailing it earlier. Not to put you on the spot, but I thought it was so helpful.
Well, I feel like it is the theme that it's really kind of the undercurrent of everything is really how do we shift away from the role of being a parent into the relationship that we have with our child. And let me think if there's something in particular. I feel like more than that, I just want to add one other thing. Is
Great.
it okay?
Yeah.
I add something else instead,
Sure.
which is, I think, one of the other critical pieces about Parenting 3.0 is that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're not looking at this isn't like some new set of ideas, like a set of strategies or something like that, but it's also not rejecting the past completely. So we're looking back and we're trying to see what we did, what we can learn from in Parenting 2.0 and in Parenting 1.0, and trying to make sure that anything that we do comes from a well-studied scientific perspective, rather than just we're trying to move away from the idea that we're a bunch of guinea pigs. And we're trying to move into a place where we have a solid footing, a solid framework from which to parent from. And I think that if someone asked me what that is, I would say it is relational. I would say that's the core of it all. And I want to take the parts where from Parenting 1.0 where there were really great relational aspects of it that people were living from. If you had parents who were really maybe controlling or overpowering, there might be a way you're like, I don't want anything to do with that either. And so there can be a way there are definitely parts of the past that we would like to not have to go back to. But there are also parts of the past that we want to make sure that we extract out. And when we move forward with this emerging parenting 3.0, that we're providing to people something that's really a nice solid foundation that we hope will bring you back to yourself and bring you back to your own innate wisdom and your own parenting instincts.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there it is.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for listening. We can't wait to hear from you, and we invite you to like this, share this, pass it on, help spread the word, and we will be back next week with some more good stuff.
Yeah. Great.
Take care.
Bye.